very pleased to have Dr. Shruti Rajagopalan today. She is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at the George Mason University and a fellow at the Classical Liberal Institute at NYU School of Law. Before joining the Mercatus Center, she was an associate professor of economics at the State University of New York, Chase College. She earned her PhD in economics from George Mason University. She has a BA in economics and LLB from University of Delhi and an LLM from the European Masters in Law and Economics program at the University of Hamburg, Ghent University, and University of Bologna. Her broad area of interest is the economic analysis of comparative legal and political systems. Her research include law and economics, public choice theory, and constitutional economics. Her research has been published in peer-reviewed journals. She also enjoys writing in popular press. We all know that. Most of you would have read that. She has a fortnightly column called The Impartial Spectator in Mint. She has also published opinion editorials on Indian political economy in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, Real Clear Politics Mint, Business Line by Hindu, and the Indian Express. And it is a real pleasure, Dr. Shruti, to welcome you and to introduce you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
The faculty, our in-house faculty who will be in conversation with Dr. Shruti is Professor Mona Mehta. She's an associate professor at the School of Arts and Sciences, Ahmedabad University. Her research include urban transformations and the remaking of city spaces, youth aspirations and skill development discourses, democracy and its vulnerabilities, and the political thought of M.K. Gandhi. She received her PhD in political science from the University of Chicago. Professor Mehta has previously taught at the Department of Politics and International Relations at Scripps College in Claremont, USA, and in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Indian Institute of Technology, Gandhinagar. She is the co-editor of a very nice book, Gujarat Beyond Gandhi, Identity, Conflict and Society. And she has authored several scholarly articles. Those who are in urban sociology, they may be familiar with her work in EPW and South Asia Journal, in Indian Sociology, Contemporary South Asia, and International Journal of Urban and Regional Research. She is currently working on a very fascinated book manuscript that examines youth aspirations and urban transformation in post-liberalization India. So we are thrilled to have both of you and we welcome both of you. And I request Professor Mona to begin the conversation.
Thank you, Sudhir. Thank you to the entire conversation series team for inviting us, and especially welcome to Shruti, Shruti Rajagopalan for agreeing to sort of engage in this very interesting conversation about cities and their dysfunctionality and what we can do about it. I mean, one of the things, the interesting things about this topic is that we are such a city-centric people, and I'm talking especially about the people who are on this conversation. That cities, I think, deeply affect our lives. We are so invested in it, personally, but also politically and economically. That I think that a lot of us feel very strongly about the subject, and we have our own opinions on this. I am not an economist, nor am I an expert on urban governance, but I have an interest in cities as a social scientist, as a qualitative, interpretive social scientist. And, so I'm really excited to have this conversation with Shruti and get her perspective on, what she thinks are the real challenges of our cities today, how they may be related to forms of urban governance, and what can we do about it. So so with that, I'd like to start off, and I'd like to start with a sort of popular narrative that we have about cities. Cities, they are a lure, they are attraction, and the problems they face, and that narrative goes something like this. India is a largely rural and agrarian country, and largely poor, and where returns on agriculture are inadequate and erratic, right? And as a result, there is a mass migration of people from the hinterlands into the cities for a better livelihood, for better opportunities, because cities are the engines of economic growth. And this process we sort of very broadly call urbanization. And we all think that this is largely a positive thing. Urbanization is widely believed to be a positive thing, except that there's a small catch, but it's not such a small catch, that this kind of mass scale urbanization puts pressures on the services, the infrastructure of cities, particularly services, basic services like water, electricity, sanitation. So this is the way this is sort of the popular narrative about cities, and they are conditioned today. So Shruti, I'd like to ask you, start off by asking us, as an economist, what is your perspective on the dismal state of our cities, and how do you see urbanization and urban migration in the Indian context?
So thank you so much. So first of all, I must thank everyone, who organized this, Professor Ravi, Professor Bijal Mehta, Professor Mona Mehta, we've been communicating with each other. So thank you so much for taking trouble to organize this and to have me. And thank you, Mona, for, taking the trouble to pull together, various different thoughts on urbanization, because I know it's such a large subject. And, exactly like you, I'm an economist. I mostly work on constitutional systems, and I'm not an urban economist, because that is a separate area of specialization, and there are a lot of people who've done a lot of work on it. But I think it's very interesting that someone from your background and my background is having this conversation, especially in the context of governance, right? That's the key that we're most concerned with. So I'll start with all your questions, because you've layered this beautifully. So first up, as an economist and also as just an individual who has been in cities my entire life, I think of cities primarily, but not only, but primarily as labor markets, right? And I'm not unique in this, the great, urban scholar Alain Berthaud, who's, at the Marion Institute at NYU, he has an excellent book that I encourage everyone to read. It's called Order Without Design. And he starts the book literally, I think it's one of the first few sentences or paragraphs saying cities are primarily labor markets, right? So everyone may come to the city for a particular reason and stay for a different reason. Just like, we may go to watch a movie for a particular reason and stay for the songs or something else. So cities attract people because they're excellent labor markets, right? And you use some very interesting terms, which you got them exactly right. The engines of growth, right? The places where people can mingle, and the way the capital and labor, all the permutations and combinations can be put together, right? That number just increases exponentially in a way that you can never have in a smaller town or in a village, right? So once again, as an economist, going back to Adam Smith, he talks about how the division of labor and specialization is the engine for economic growth and productivity, right? But how do you get division in labor and specialization? Literally the next chapter, Adam Smith says it is limited by the size of the market, right? So the larger the market, the greater the division of labor and specialization that you'll get, right? So if you're in a small town, right, you may have a chai stall, right? You may even get, let's say, a pizza place or something like that, but you're not going to get sushi, right? To get sushi, you need to be in a big city. You need to be in Ahmedabad. You need to be in Mumbai. You need to be in, New York City and places like that. So the division of labor and specialization is key. And I think that's the way I think about cities. Now, you said something really interesting about migration, right? We saw recently the terrible plight of migrants, how they got trapped in the city and they were forced to walk, thousands of kilometers, in some cases, hundreds at least, back to their villages. They have all come for a better future. And we know that they are sort of the bottom of the priority, listing as far as city governance is concerned. Nobody cares about these poor migrants, right? And they don't live in great conditions, and still they come to cities. And I think the reason is exactly as you mentioned, Mona. They are engines of economic growth. They're spots of opportunity. And I think, the way I would couch that is I primarily look at it from the lens of, a labor market. Now, the last part you mentioned was urbanization and its pressures, which I completely agree with you. But, just to think about it now, let's go back to, yourself and Ravi and Bijal and everyone who Sudhir put this conversation together, right? You must have anticipated a certain number of people, right? And when you realize that that number is going to be quite large, you don't say we don't want people to attend the conversation, right? Like, what do? You find a really good software, you find Zoom, right? You make sure that it can handle 30, 40, 50 people. I think we're almost at 50 people right now. You make sure that, you let us know what are the broadband requirements, everything works. Now we can have this fantastic conversation. Sudhir has run some great polls, right? It's so we can anticipate and we say, oh, we can deal with it. We can create the infrastructure for it. Whereas the peculiar thing about urbanization is we keep blaming people for going to cities. you know, we don't think about it as a supply side problem or constraint. We always say, oh, there are more people coming to cities and they are putting the pressure, right? And I think we need to flip that, that lens in India. And you may probably agree, since you come from political science and you think about democratic feedback and structures in terms of governance. I think this is a really large missing gap in India. I have never blamed the student for being present in my class if there are not enough chairs. I blame the university administration for not having enough chairs in the class, right? And I think the same way about cities.
Great. So I think you really sort of touched upon some very core issues. The point is not when we look at the crisis of cities, their dysfunctionality. The point is not to sort of blame the migrants who come in and the labor, which is according to you the sort of the peg on which cities function, but really kind of ask the other question. If cities then are still dysfunctional, the problem lies somewhere else. And, and the problem, of course, you have identified, is the question of how we are governing our cities, right? And can we find some answers to urban dysfunctionality in the question, not of migration, but of governance? And so, and that's a nice segue, I think, into your very interesting article called The State of Indian Cities, which just came out. And in that, you argue very cogently that the basic services in cities, such as sanitation, electricity, fire, etc., fire safety, are unavailable to its residents. And the main reason that you pinpoint is not so much, that we don't have local governance structures. So they, even when they do exist, and local governance structures have constitutional recognition, and you talk a lot about the 74th Amendment that put in place these local governance structures. The problem is that even when they do exist and they have constitutional recognition, what they lack is fiscal autonomy. And and powers really to deliver the services, and these functions. So that's sort of the argument you make, Shruti, which I think is a very compelling argument. And but I think one way to sort of talk about urban governance is that when we think of cities, the best way to think about them is that, like Shiva Ramakrishna says, they're multiplicities, right? The problem with our cities is that there are, multiple agencies with overlapping, sometimes competing, jurisdictions, powers, etc., of these local bodies. And so, that's part of the problem. So my question to you is, when you talk about fiscal autonomy, how do you define it? Specifically, should fiscal autonomy include, the autonomy to visualize and plan future development? Or should it be restricted to sort of really executing existing resources or accessing resources in order to implement projects that have been visualized by expert bodies that are actually not elected? So that's my question.
Yeah, I mean, you really cracked open the can of worms, so thank you for that. So, I want to take a couple of steps back, right? The idea, the incredible thing about cities is because they are such thriving labor markets and they produce so much economic growth, it is valuable to invest in them. Right? Is it valuable to invest in an empty parking lot in the middle of nowhere in some rural area? It's not that clear. right? But is it valuable to invest in sanitation in Ahmedabad? Absolutely, right? I mean, just look at the amount of money it's generating. So the prosperity is there. There is willingness to pay, right? There is money that exists for this. There's a demand for it. People want better governance. So then the question for me is what is the mechanism which is broken that this better governance does not, actually show up in outcomes or doesn't actually manifest itself, right? So I want to start, sort of the big picture and down. Now, the question you're asking is money important, right? And who should make the decisions, right? And my argument is very straightforward. The people, whoever raises the money, right, they are only going to answer to the people who gave them the money, right? So now let's think public finance, right? I'm stepping away from cities for just a moment. So in broad public finance, there are two ways, or three ways predominantly for any government, urban, local, central, to raise money, right? Now, at a federal level, the first is you can raise your own taxes, right? And that means you need a constituency of taxpayers who are willing to pay taxes to you. The second is intergovernmental transfers, right? The union government takes money from one state government and gives it to another state government, which we do all the time in India. And the third is debt, right? You can raise your own bonds. This is predominantly the three things. Now let's think about the mechanism for each of the three, right? When you raise your own revenues, you're answerable to the people who are paying tax, as long as the people who are taxpayers are also voters, right? So if you break the connection between your taxpayers and your voters, then things start going terribly wrong, right? So if the taxpayer is in Tamil Nadu, right, and the voter is in Bihar, and the mechanism by which we're doing this is intergovernmental transfers, it's never going to be a tight feedback mechanism, right? The same way I imagine in Gujarat, right? Ahmedabad's a big city, but there are parts of rural Gujarat, right? So if your taxpayers are in the big cities, and your voters are all in rural areas, you are only going to get lots of agricultural subsidies and loan waivers and cooperative farming subsidies, but you're never really going to get that much urban governance, right? So that's the part that's broken. What is the feedback link with debt? Now, debt is not a big problem in India because very few cities actually raise their own bonds, but abroad it's a bigger problem. And there is only one thing we need to be concerned about. Debt means that the people who are benefiting are in the present and the people who are paying for it are in the future, right? If the debt does not materialize or work out. So in one sense, it's an intergenerational transfer, right? My grandkids will end up paying for whatever bridge I want to build today, which may also be fine, but that's the way to think about it. So now the main thing, to go back to the core question, Mona, which you asked, is when the link between those who pay and those who govern is broken, then we have problems. Now, going back to Sivaraman's point and, all that entire literature on expert authorities proliferating, the problem is not just that there are too many authorities. The problem is also, it's not clear who they're accountable to. Some of them are accountable to the union government. Some of them are accountable to a particular program started by the Planning Commission, right? That's where they get their money. Some of them are accountable to the state government, right? Some of them are accountable to some special grant that came through Panchayati Raj, but some got diverted to urban areas. So the problem is not just that there are too many bosses. The problem is that the bosses are not the people, right? The people who vote for them are not the bosses. So if you see, we have so much engagement and voter turnout when it comes to union government elections. We need the same thing for state and local level elections, right? We don't get the same turnout for municipal elections, but they're the people who are actually going to pick up the trash, actually going to pave the roads, going to make sure that, there isn't flooding or waterlogging, all the basic things that we deal with, open defecation. So I think that's the part we need to flip. You can have lots and lots of agencies as long as all of them are funded by the people who are voting for, whoever is running those agencies. It could be a city commissioner, it could be a municipal commissioner. And second, the same people who vote are also paying the taxes, right? Then that feedback mechanism is tight. I'll just make one last point before, wanting to hear Mona's thoughts on this. And that is, if you notice, there's a lot of private, condominium developments and things like that. Like, I'm from Delhi, so I saw this happen in Noida and Gurgaon, like, lots and lots of private enclaves. And my parents live in one such enclave in Noida. And I went with them to, the meeting, the building association meeting. And they are really loud, argumentative. Everyone has a point of view. They are really concerned. They have factions. Building 10 doesn't want the trash near it because the residents of building 10 don't want the smell or whatever, right? They even have factions. It's democratic politics in a minuscule. And when you think about why isn't this happening right outside when the municipal election is happening? It's because there's no connection. These people pay building fees, right? And they want their governance. They want their trash to be picked up. They want the air to be clean. They want the water filtration system to work, right? There is a committee in my parents' building for water desalination, right? I mean, it's incredible. So all this talent exists, the demand exists, the money exists, but the feedback mechanism is broken. And that's the part you as political scientists, me as economist, that's the puzzle we all need to put our head together and work out, I think.
So, Shruti, then, how do you establish this feedback mechanism? Are you saying then that it is the urban local bodies who should tax, who are elected, and therefore they should actually make the urban development plans rather than these expert bodies? So that's the sort of clarification question that I had. And the other question is really, is it always about being able to pay for a service or be able to pay taxes? What about the people at the very bottom of our sort of urban ladder, people who are even below the taxable sort of level? If you can't pay for a basic service just because you're so poor, what then are your rights in terms of accessing urban amenities? Do you have any rights if you can't pay?
Oh no, this is great set of questions. So I'll take the tax one the last. On the first part of what about everything outside of payment, right? What about the democratic process? I would want your thoughts on that too. But I'll give you the constitutional economics perspective, and maybe you can give me the democratic process perspective on this. Now, the thing with urban local bodies in India, there's a lot of constitutional history to it. But the fact of the matter is, we never really set up urban local bodies, right? The big cities inherited a municipal corporation from the British, and they sort of, continued on. So this is your, Bombay presidency, Madras presidency, all these places had their big municipal corporation in Chennai and Mumbai and things. So that's one part. There were some states, so the Constitution of India left it to the state governments to then decide what to do about cities, right? Now, the problem was twofold. One, there was never really a local governance, framework in the Indian Constitution, which runs like 395 articles. So they could have really added this, right? It wasn't for brevity, but that didn't exist. They thought the states were best designed to do this, which is not a wrong point of view. It can still work. The trouble is, India also went towards central planning at the same time, right? So not only did we not have local governments, even the state governments were hugely looking towards the union government, right? Because the union government controlled the entire taxation system. Like today, we give, I believe it's a 41-59 split between union and states. There used to be a point of time when it was 80-20, 90-10, right? So it's even the state governments are looking at the planning commission. They're looking at the union government for their funding, right? So everything that the state government spends money on is looking above. It's never looking at your constituents. I think that is one major source of problem, and this is a historical inheritance. Now, once we come to the urban local body framework that you mentioned, so who should be making the plans? I think the big problem with the current urban local body system is, once again, we've created a layer of government. We've created a layer of democratic process by which we elect these governments. But most of the states have not devolved any powers to these urban local bodies, right? So once again, the urban local bodies need to look at the bureaucrat, state government bureaucrat or the union government bureaucrat for money, for plan approval and all these things, whereas they should be looking towards their constituents. Now, when it comes to taxation, I'll tell you the great news, okay? City level taxation is incredibly progressive. Okay, so when I say progressive, so, the basics of taxation, if you're thinking about a progressive tax, are that people who enjoy higher levels of income or higher levels of wealth pay a larger proportion than people who enjoy lower levels of income and lower levels of wealth, right? So this is not an efficiency argument, it's an equity argument. Regressive taxation systems are those where people who are poorer end up paying a larger proportion of their income in taxes, right? So you all can imagine any system that relies on consumption taxes is incredibly regressive, right? Because the really poor person who is living on $1 a day, right, is paying right now, I mean, just to explain this in context, we have 18% tax, GST, okay, on Parle-G biscuits, right? We're all familiar with Parle-G biscuits. There's a 5 rupee pack, right? Poor people who that day didn't get their daily wage, instead of sleeping hungry, typically, get a pack of Parle-G biscuit for 5 rupees and they, consume that. So it is as close to a basic human right, that 5 rupee pack of Parle-G biscuits as you can get. We impose as a society 18% tax on that. Okay, so consumption taxes in general tend to be regressive. Consumption taxes on goods like this are incredibly regressive. What is a progressive tax? Taxing wealth and taxing things that people of high income enjoy, right? The most progressive tax you can imagine is actually a property tax, right? Typically, property tax depends on the value of the property, right? Rich people live in neighborhoods which are valued at higher prices, right? Poorer people live in poorer. So there's literally nothing fairer linking income and wealth to contributions than a property tax, right? So my recommendation actually is exactly what you're saying, Mona. I mean, we need poor people to be able to enjoy basic services in a city without having to pay a user fee for it all the time. Now, how do we do that? I'm not recommending that rich people and poor people both pay the same 200 rupees for garbage cleanup. My suggestion is have a really strong link between payment of tax and delivery of services. And people who live in poorer neighborhoods, renters, they are likely to pay a very small fraction of their income, if any, in property taxes. And people who are rich and own vast, sums of property or vast amount of property will pay more. Now, the best part about this tax is evasion is really incentive incompatible. What I mean by that is you have to hide how much property you own to evade taxes, which actually hurts you more, right? Because then you can't buy and sell that property and you can't realize the full value of it. So no, everyone wants to show less income than what they actually make. Everyone wants to show more property than they actually own, right? So this comes from, of course, I didn't invent property taxes. I mean, you can read like, Henry George and, Adam Smith, there, John Stuart Mill. There's so many people who've talked about local government taxes and property taxes. But I think that's the way to bridge this. So people like my parents, people like us, those on this podcast, we have the ability to check out of bad governance systems and go into quasi-private systems and pay user fees, right? The poor don't have that option, so they're in slums. And my suggestion is, look at all this money that there exists. How do we make sure that it creates a common public good? And I think that can only happen when we empower urban local governments with money and responsibility, right? It's not just enough to elect them. We also have to give them money and they have to be responsible to taxpayers. Now, again, it's a question. There are some, cities that are growing where you may want 70% to be raised in tax revenues and 30% through intergovernmental transfers or something like that. There may be some cities like Mumbai which actually generate more tax than they need, as is the case year on year. So, there can be a split, but right now there is no split. I mean, there's nothing. Our reliance on local tax revenues is abysmal. I believe municipal taxes make up 1% of GDP, which is really, really low, right? So I think that's the part which we need to square. And, just from a human rights point of view, India's reliance on consumption taxes hurts the poor the most, right? And then how do the rich get out of it? They lobby. I mean, you're all from Gujarat. There's a Gujarat lobby for gemstones and gold, right? We're aware of it. And it's a hugely productive industry. So I have nothing against the industry. But just before the Gujarat elections after demonetization, they managed to lobby and bring their GST down to between 2 and 3%, and for gemstones under 1%. So if I walk into Tanishq, I pay less than 3% in GST, right? If I buy Parle G biscuits, I pay 18% GST. Now you tell me who's buying Parle G biscuits and who's going to Tanishq, right? And I think urban local property taxes work in a very similar way. And that's the thing we need to harness. That's the energy and the money we need to harness.
Great. I think that's a point very well taken, that we really need to sort of, marry constitutional rights and accountability with a sort of reform of taxation, which is going to bring, the economic resources needed, to sort of solve this problem of delivering services to everybody, not just the rich, right? And those who can pay. And,
So my question to you, Mona, is now, how would you fill this democratic gap, right? I mean, you're working on, urban areas, but also like, how do we get more youth to participate? How do we get more people to not just show up and vote, but also, not episodic engagement, but constant engagement? So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that part of the puzzle, because you do need regular governance and feedback mechanism for this, right? Not just money.
right. But, I don't have an answer to that question in terms of how you can, how you can increase participation necessarily, although I do think that there is a big issue of participation. But the point that I wanted to sort of talk about is, the government has, for instance, brought about what they call reforms in the form of these urban renewal missions, right?
Yes.
Urban renewal missions were meant to, at one level, deal with poverty and urban poverty, but also to look at, how to make cities more attractive for economic investments and therefore sort of more powerful engines of economic growth. And one of the things that JNURM did early on and later on the other missions was that it tried to sort of, enforce certain fiscal disciplinary measures on municipal bodies. But do you think that, and I'm not sure whether taxation was part of this, and maybe you could respond to that. But my sense is that there's, as far as sort of fiscal autonomy is concerned, urban renewal missions did not really, they enforce a certain kind of fiscal discipline, but did not really bring a certain kind of autonomy. So do you think that, is that one of the, would you say that is a fair reading of, the kinds of reforms that urban renewal missions brought about at the local of urban governance, or
So
didn't bring about?
So absolutely. So you kind of hit the nail on the head, right? So let's chart out both the money and the accountability for these, rural, urban renewal missions and things like that. It typically starts with the union government, right? There will be, in Nehru's time, it used to start with a mission statement for the 5-year plan, and now we have different things, for the Modi administration, it might be a recommendation from Niti Aayog or someone else, right? So typically the union government says, we need, urban renewal. It will find a way into some kind of a program. The money used to go through the planning commission initially. And they will tell them, this is the amount of money. These are the goals. You need to cover X number of districts that have Y number of people. And you need to build whatever you're building, or, you need to plant so many trees. There were different versions of the urban renewal mission. The more recent versions have all been about ecology and housing. The older versions used to be slightly different. They used to be electrification, right? Water services, things like that. And then the person who is running these there will be like a special bureaucrat who is sent from the IAS cadre. This is the point person to manage this mission. This is your budget and this is your deliverable, right? So that's typically how these things were managed. Now, the question is, do they know what needs to be done in the cities, right? Number one, do we need more trees in the city, right? Or do we need to make sure that we solve the water problem so that then people are not, having their own bore wells and tube wells, which will automatically solve the ecological problem, right? So one is, when you are that centralized, there is not a good sense of what the problem is, right?
Absolutely.
Second, the problem is different in different places, right? I mean, if you're from Delhi, the problem is drought. If you're from Bombay, the problem is waterlogging, right? So different cities also have, even within water, even within ecology, different cities have different problems, right? So when you centralize these missions with deliverables, that becomes quite complicated. And the third thing is that the person who was in charge of this, right, was always someone who was looking at the union government and saying, you told me to do something and I have done it, right? They were not the people talking to regular folks in the constituency in Ahmedabad saying, can you tell us which is the area where you would like more trees, right? Sometimes it's good to cut trees because it's good to expand the road, reduce congestion, and that actually reduces air pollution, right? So sometimes, so there is no, there is no one size fits all that says we should never cut trees, right? Sometimes you want to plant the tree somewhere else, reduce the congestion and bottleneck here, right? Sometimes you want to cut a lot of trees to have a metro, potentially, but that reduces congestion so much that in the longer run, you actually have more sustainable systems, right? Sometimes it's not about the tree, it's about the lack of a bus service. If there is no sensible bus service in any city, then, how do poor people travel? They're taking all these tempos and autos, which actually pollute a fair bit, right? So you actually need to like really look below, and I don't use above and below in a normative like good and bad sort of sense. When I say below, I really mean grassroots, right? What do these people want, right? Now if you go to Mumbai, you ask them, do you want playgrounds for your children? They'll say no. They can just play in the park or they can play in the street. Land is too valuable for playgrounds, right? But if you ask them in the same place, instead of playground, you want a metro, they're likely to say yes, right? Kids can play in the local park. Every school doesn't need a massive cricket size playground, right? And kids can play somewhere else, or different schools can get together and have a common ground, things like that. But a metro will flip things. So even when it comes to using common resources, there is a certain level of law of numbers which the democratic process reflects, right? Who is voting, how they want these things done. Everyone in Mumbai wants slums to go away. No one knows how to make them go away, right? So it's not like we don't know the problem. In some cases we know it. In some cases we just don't know how to pinpoint and slowly start cleaning it up. So I think this is one huge problem with these renewal missions. They come with a one size fits all. They come with a mandate that says plant Y number of trees and X number of toilets or whatever, and it just doesn't work despite the best of intentions.
I think that's a point very well taken. And I think that goes back to, again, the question, not so much of how do we get people to participate, but how do we get these top-down plans, which are run by bureaucrats, which are run by sort of these body of unelected experts. How do we sort of transform these bodies such that they are actually accountable to the elected and are actually much more democratic bodies in the sense that they are more representative? So I think there, and the JNURM and these missions really sort of are examples of how things are so I think so non-representative in that sense, and so top down, right? Where the local really doesn't, does not really feature in these plans at all. And, this, Shruti, actually leads me to another sort of conversation very much related to this, is the question of private cities as one model of an alternative governance structure. You've studied it. You've written a wonderful paper on this. You've written a paper on looking at private cities, using the case of Gurgaon, but also looking at other Walt Disney city and Jamshedpur, etc., and talking about what we can learn from private cities, what works with them and what doesn't. So, I want you to sort of maybe just for the benefit of our audience, tell us very briefly, what you think works in private cities, and what we could borrow from them, if at all we could, in terms of reforming governance structures. And I also have a piggyback question on that, if I can ask you that,
Yes,
right?
I just know. Yeah.
And then my real question that then connects this question to what we have been discussing so far, which is the question of genuine federalism, is how do you sort of reconcile private cities and their logic with democratic federalism, where we just spent so much time talking about how do people actually hold these planners and these developers of these private cities actually accountable in terms of elections. So can you respond to
Yes.
that?
Absolutely. So, this is a great question. So I just want to put it out there that when we studied Gurgaon, we kind of came up with this is Alex Tabrock and myself, my co-author who's also at George Mason. And we kind of came up with the title because we were initially trying to understand what is going on in Gurgaon, right? I mean, it had this exponential rise as a local economy. I grew up in Delhi, and I remember when I was a kid, Gurgaon and all were like so far, you went there for a picnic. I mean, there's nothing there, right? It's all past the airport, nobody lives there and things like that. And then between say year 2000 and even actually mid 90s to year 2010, in those 15 years, I think Gurgaon was growing at say 1000 to 1200% a year, right? So it's like this exponential growth. This of course happened because of the IT revolution, the business processing outsourcing that took place in various parts of the world. And Gurgaon is this bizarre city. When I was studying it didn't have a municipal corporation, but it had 400 of the 500 Fortune 500 companies. And we're like, what's going on here? This makes no sense, right? And then we ask people, why do you live in Gurgaon? It's so dysfunctional. They don't have a sewage system. They're really rich, educated people. They say, we came here for the jobs, right? So we figured that Gurgaon became a labor market really, really quickly. Now, for various dysfunctional reasons, the way the constitution assigns what is a city and what is not a city requires a certain number of people. It's a very high standard. So in year 2001, Gurgaon was still not characterized as a city, but it was growing very quickly, right? By year 2011, when it became a city, it already had like a couple of million people and didn't have basic municipal governance. So that's kind of the Gurgaon story. So how did people fill the gap in the lack of this missing municipal governance structure, right? Private parties stepped in, right? So basically what ended up happening was a very bizarre patchwork privatization, right? So each condo building, each enclave that DLF built or the Unsels built became their own private enclave, right? They build the roads, so you have sewage system in DLF phase 1, for instance. It's not connected to any main, right? So septic tanks will come to the edge of phase 1. They will collect everything and they will take it. Now, what do they do? Because these are private people who are self-interested, they will go dump it in a common, public land or public lake or something like that, right? So this is what was going on. Same problem with water. They're not connected to a big water system. So each building is boring its own water, right? I have friends who live in DLF phase, whichever phase, they had independent homes and they had their own bore wells. I mean, that's an air pollution nightmare. It's a groundwater table nightmare. You have an urbanizing city, so you're cutting trees and the groundwater in Gurgaon is depleting so fast. You're like, why can't they have a water system? These are some of the richest people in India living here. Same thing with security, right? Gurgaon had about 1,000x more private security than they had local police, right? Why? Because there is so much valuable property that needs to be protected, right? So people start investing in these services, right? Every building, every home has its own private security guard. You can imagine how inefficient it is. The true surprise for me was also that places like Gurgaon came up with public goods. The most classic example of a public good is not even a road and things, because you can exclude people. It's really like a fire station, right? Because you can't be haggling when there is a fire on how much the private person's going to charge. That's why we have, fire stations as the universal public good. DLF actually built a fire station that would respond to people, right? And when you ask, I spoke to the, DLF fire chief and I said, you're a private company. Why do you have a world-class fire system? And they said, we have billions worth of property to protect. We can't afford a fire. If there's a fire in the GE complex, no one will invest in Gurgaon and all our properties values will collapse. So there was some really good privatization that was happening. And all this filled the gaps, because the government didn't provide a fire station, the government didn't provide a sewage system, all this was being provided. Now I'll tell you the flip side, okay? The flip side was none of these were big enough, right? So there's massive inefficiency. If each home and each building is running its own garbage unit, is polluting by having their own backup electricity and running a diesel generator, is running their own borewell and tube well, you can imagine what happens to the ecology, right? The second problem, they take all this garbage, right? They never pollute within DLF. The incentive mechanism works great there, but they will dump at the edge of the property, right? And they don't dump in Ansal's property, which is also private, by the way. It's not like they're dumping on their competition. They're dumping in public land, right behind slums where the people are living, to work in the big city environment. So this is what we found. And what we learned, Alex and I, when we were studying other private cities, was that places in Gurgaon, all the little enclaves, they weren't big enough. You build a really large city like, say, Jamshedpur, or Walt Disney City, then you can internalize all these bad externalities. You can have your own water unit, you can have your own power unit. It is valuable and feasible to build your own sewage system and actually treat the sewage before you dump it, because you can't dump it anywhere else. So we found that the cities are actually, the private enclaves are too small. Now, does this mean that I want to privatize cities in India? Absolutely not. Right? We were pointing out something very specific, that in the absence of public governance, the private sector stepped in and it provided the governance, right? And then we tried to find in what areas is it efficient and where is it inefficient. Private garbage pickup, very efficient. It's not a problem, right? In fact, in most functional cities even, there is private garbage pickup almost everywhere, right? But private boring of your own water, incredibly inefficient and like just destruction of ecology, right? Private sewage system, not feasible. It just doesn't work, right? No one has it. So so we were trying to look at the margins of when this will become efficient versus when it'll become inefficient. That was kind of the goal. So the goal is not that, hey, let's privatize Mumbai tomorrow. That's not what we're saying, right? So it is a question of, do the people who are the residual claimants, the people who are collecting money and taxes, in this case, it's user fee, right? Each building or resident is going to pay user fees. So each of those people, are they accountable in some way? And the second is, DLF actually built the first privately financed metro, right? Now, there are lots of people who built a a private metro, but it's usually financed by the state. DLF had enough property in Gurgaon where they believed that the property values will rise if they build private roads and private metro, right? So that tells you that if the scale is large enough and the people are rich enough, the private sector will step in, right? And when I say people are rich enough, I don't mean individuals, I mean as a group, right? Gurgaon is a very rich city, right? It's very productive people. Ahmedabad's a very rich city. We just haven't tapped into it, right? Ahmedabad has lots of wealth. Surat has lots of wealth. Gurgaon has lots of wealth, right? So these are rich spaces, and DLF found a way to tap into it in a way that, the Gurgaon Municipal Corporation, which came in 2011, I think they had their first elections in 2015 or something. I mean, it's in the paper. I just don't remember off the top of my head. So by the time they even had some basic municipal governance, it was ridiculous. And I'll tell you one final tiny thing, on the fire station. It was a hilarious conversation. I'm having this conversation with, they wish to be anonymous, but imagine someone very, very high in the fire system at DLF, okay? So I say, but why don't you rely on the public fire system? And they say, we have skyscrapers and the government fire station is fighting it with pitchkaris. Okay, which is the Hindi word for a water pistol. And that difference was just incredible to me. I'm like, here we're talking about the government of Haryana. Haryana is a rich state, right? We're not talking about poor places of India anymore. We're not talking about Bimaru districts and all. Haryana is such a rich state, and they cannot afford to have a fire station to protect one of the most valuable cities within Haryana, right? And the private guy can. So that incentive mechanism breaking, I mean, in that Pichkari example, it was just crystal clear to me that, we need to pull together the governance and the fiscal.
So you're so you're not saying that private cities are an answer to the dysfunctionality of Indian cities, but you're looking at private cities and seeing that, well, where they worked, with limited success, and they could have worked more if the privatization was at a larger scale.
Yes.
And that would have sort of solved the problems of what you call externalities, right?
Yeah, which are really ecological problems. I mean, we're all breathing the same air. So we have all these cool technical terms for it, but it's really like, like just the world we are living in.
But you do agree that while private cities may be efficient, that they are completely bereft of a democratic federal sort of kind of loop mechanism, right? A feedback mechanism where, those who can afford to live in these rich cities, would live, and then there are what happens to those who, can't afford these services. And of course, you do pay a lot of attention to the fact that market competition would automatically sort of provide, reasonable services. But that brings me to another question about, the scale of cities, which comes back in some ways to a more fundamental issue. And this is the sort of the elephant in the room, which is that cities, much as popular discourse talks about cities as the sort of centers of urbanization, the kind of recent research has shown that actually the level of urbanization in India is only 32%, right? And in fact, now, which is almost like 60 or 62% in China. So it's not only comparatively to, say, another Asian country, we are not that urbanized. But the other thing is that cities are not the primary sites of urbanization. So if you look at the last census, much of the urbanization is really happening outside of metropolitan cities. Urbanization rates have gone down in the traditional metro cities, right? All this urbanization is happening, what scholars have called rurbanization, subaltern urbanization. There are several words that have been used to describe it, what are basically census towns, right? But they don't have urban governance structures for various reasons, partly because people don't want to give up their lands, people don't want to pay high taxes, etc. So how do you kind of view, how do you think we can sort of address this real problem of urbanization, which is that we're looking at cities, but the urbanization is happening somewhere else. So how do you understand this problem, and what do you think how should we respond to it?
So just as a big question, right? Like as an economist, my first assumption always is people are rational and self-interested. They know what they're doing, right? So now then the question is, why are they doing what they're doing, right? That's my typical lens of looking at anything. Why are people not going to the largest labor markets, which presumably typically offer a higher wage, and they're going somewhere else, right? That probably means that either the largest, wage markets are not providing a higher wage, which is enough to live in Mumbai or afford the real estate or whatever, or it's not that easy to get a job, or something else. I have to live in a slum.
If I may come back on this, one of the reasons is that cities don't really have that many jobs, in the sense that there's growth, but there's jobless growth, which is one of the reasons why, people aren't really flocking to cities, but there's all this flocking going on in other areas, maybe around cities, other, in what, for, what we call sort of the census towns,
urban areas, towns,
right,
things like that. Well, I will disagree on the people aren't flocking to cities, right? The question is, are they moving permanently? Are they seasonal workers? There aren't enough jobs in the formal economy, but the number of jobs in the informal economy just bounced back after demonetization, right? It took a body blow and then it came back. Now, after this migrant crisis, the pandemic, as it's slowing down, people are actually coming back. So all the mobility data shows that people are going back from the village to the cities, right? Now, you are right in the sense that they are not moving their families. Their kids are not coming and enrolling in the local municipal corporation school and things like that. So there is a question of why that bizarre behavior is going on. Normally, when I move somewhere, I vote with my feet. I also vote with my wallet, and I vote with my vote, right? But in India, those three things have split up. So I'll start with each. Oh my God, you've asked so many great like layered questions, right? So I'll start with the first, which is there is something going on about big cities where people of a certain skill level simply cannot afford to be there, right? So they end up going to peri-urban areas, they end up going to suburban areas, and so on and so forth, right? And the other side, the supply side, is we are not, we are far more urban than the data suggest, right? And there's some great work on this. I can put in the paper link later, but this is some research that is done by Vaidehi Tandel, who's at IDFC Institute in Mumbai. And they have basically found that because of the way we define cities, by the time we update the definition of the city, it is so late that we are not recognizing a lot of areas as urban areas. So if you use, say, the Brazilian standard or the Swiss standard or the UK standard, then India is almost like 40-45% urban. If you use the Indian standard, it's about 31% urban, give or take. So India is more urban if you think about urbanization as density of population, right? Of certain number of people conglomerating in specific areas. So that is one thing, out there. I think, you're right in that we need to like parse out a little bit more carefully what's happening. Now, one really bizarre thing that, the parliament did, and I have no idea why they did it because it sounds so stupid, is instead of just calling it local body or local government, they said Panchayati Raj institution for rural areas and urban local body for urban areas. As if God has ordained these spots as urban and rural and they shall forever remain that way. In a country as young as ours, which is urbanizing as quickly as ours, where agricultural productivity is as low as ours, it's not rocket science to figure out that India is going to urbanize, right? India is the fastest urbanizing country just in terms of numbers, because the numbers are so large. So when they designated this, it is impossible to change the definition of a Panchayati Raj institution into an urban local government, right? And nobody wants to do it because we know we spend more money in terms of subsidies and loans and everything else, renewal missions, for rural bodies than urban bodies. Just figure out who is the cabinet minister for rural and welfare, rural development and welfare, and who's the one for urban. You'll never know the name of the guy who's the urban minister, right? That's some rubbish portfolio with very little money. It's always the rural, right? That's the economy we've focused on. So there are various political economy reasons for why these places are not designated as urban, why it is impossible to switch from Panchayati Raj to an urban system, and so on and so forth. So actually, India is more urban than the data reflect. And now let's take a real great success story, right? Kerala, right? Kerala actually decentralized or federalized even before the amendments, the 73rd and 74th amendments in the early 90s. So Kerala is almost 100% urban if you go by certain definitions, right? But they are again predominantly Panchayati Raj institutions, but these Panchayati Raj institutions are now acting like urban local bodies in that they are providing services demanded by their residents who are now urban residents. Right? They're the same people, right? The problems in urban versus rural areas, in rural areas, it might be irrigation, it might be lighting, right? In urban areas, it might be paving roads, it might be garbage pickup. But Panchayati Raj is a well enough developed institution that it caters to these problems, and it's also started collecting taxes in places like Kerala. In places like Bihar, the tax collection is very slow, it's bad. Now, even rich states like Punjab and Haryana have no incentive to urbanize or show that they are urban, even though they are rich and they are willing to urbanize, because all the money isn't staying rural, right? All their money and subsidies and MSP, everything comes to the rural economy. So I think that is something we do need to resolve. My recommendation is, who told you what is urban and what is rural? Just call it a local government and be done with it, right? The number of people who exist are the number of people who will vote.
No, you're absolutely right, Shruti. This is a definitional problem, which is why we're showing up as less urban when we are actually more urban. But there are so many political reasons why they don't want to change, the sort of the definitional categories. So I think there are so many questions in the chat, but I really have to ask you one more question, and I have Sudhir's permission for that. I think, I want to. And this will be the final question. If I get a chance for some others, and I'll piggyback on people's questions, but basically, I want to turn the question of fiscal autonomy of ULBs or urban local bodies on its head for a moment, and say that sometimes the problem is not that we don't have enough money, but the problem is that what happens when you have huge access to huge pot of money in the form of these, for instance, these urban renewal missions, and how do we spend that money, right? And I'm thinking here of projects of aestheticization, beautification, gentrification. And I'm thinking of Ahmedabad here, which is famous not today for the Sabarmati ashram of Gandhi, but famous for the Sabarmati riverfront, which is a very controversial project that basically displaced 14,000 families living along the sort of the arid, dried out banks of the Sabarmati, and sort of their livelihoods, they were not adequately resettled, and it became a very controversial project. But all these forms of gentrification projects happen with what is now called basically SPV, right, the special purpose vehicle, which are completely dominated by middle class experts, planners. They have no electoral accountability, right? And so this is a major way in which middle class aspirations shape cities, right? So sometimes the question is, of course, not just of fiscal autonomy, but going back to, who decides how to shape these cities, and what are we to do of these parastatal agencies that are really determining, how to use huge funds, and how they're spending it, completely excluding the urban poor, and the marginalized. So sort of what is your take on
When
that?
I say urban autonomy, I don't just mean someone gave us a pot of money and now you can do whatever you want with it, which is frankly what is happening in India. When I say urban autonomy, I really mean that the people who are voting for you and the people who are paying you taxes are very tightly aligned. They need not be the exact same person. Like I said, richer people pay more property taxes and so on. But the same group of people need to be voting for you and paying you taxes.
So then do you think that these SPVs are actually
They're
not
terrible. They are extra legal bodies. They have no constitutional accountability. They don't even have democratic accountability, or to be honest, Mona, because these missions come somewhere from the top. The upar se, that's the lingo I grew up with in Delhi, right? Upar se order aaya hai. And what they end up doing is, they are not accountable to your local municipal commissioner who represents the people. They are not accountable even to the, state MLA or things like that. They are only accountable directly to Prime Minister or someone in Planning Commission, or, someone in rural development or urban development sitting in, North and South Block and things like that. So one is accountability exists not to the people. It exists to either some bureaucrat or to some minister who is so far removed from the people, right? It's literally like, some minister who came from a constituency in Tamil Nadu is going to become your urban, union minister for urban development. And now that guy is going to tell us what to do with the Sabarmati river bank, So it's not, I don't mean to split India in states and, linguistic identity or anything, but I literally mean that the person who's making these decisions has nothing to do with the constituents, right?
And it's also
So
sometimes these are dominated by local elites too.
Yes, no, but I don't think they're dominated by local elites. They are captured by local elites.
Yes.
Once they exist, then of course your, middle class local busybodies will get together and say, it's not just local busybodies, right? I know what you mean by all this slum redevelopment, but even look at what the Supreme Court is doing. In Delhi, we call them the slum demolition machine. Some 10 middle class people will file a PIL. right? Then the Supreme Court judges will say these beggars, these slum dwellers are an eyesore. I mean, this is the language that they use. They actually use words like eyesore. They actually use words like they are unsanitary. I mean, they've like lost all perspective of what it means to be a judge, or actually what it means to be a human being sometimes, right? And then they say they are irregular, they are illegal. I mean, this is the language Donald Trump uses to describe immigrants, that our judges and politicians are using to describe slum dwellers who are, by the way, working in our homes. I mean, you want to say slum dwellers like there's some alien bodies, but they are the people who are doing work in your homes. They are the ones driving your cars. They are the one taking your kids to school. I mean, they are us,
I
right?
couldn't agree
So
with you
there
more,
is a
Shruti, on
big,
this. Yeah.
yeah. So, there is one is accountability and perspective. The other is, these special local bodies, these public-private partnerships, they are all extrajudicial authorities. They've come out of nowhere. They are basically diktats by executive order, right? And even when it's a very well-meaning mission, there's a problem. So I'll give you an example of a well-meaning mission, which is a really big problem, right? Something like the Sabarbati Ashram, for instance, right? There is a question of developing the ecology around a riverbed, no doubt, right? Now the question is, are the people involved in that development, or are you saying the people are the cause of the lack of development? We're going to pick them up, we're going to throw them in the trash.
Yeah, it was the latter in this case.
It's always the latter. That is not the case, which is, happening in Gurgaon, right? The people are getting together and building their amphitheater. I mean, there is a whole mission in DLF, I remember about 10 years ago, let's plant more amalta trees. Amaltas are those beautiful with the yellow flowers that flower in Delhi at a particular time. They have these missions. They're not throwing anyone out because they are the people. They don't want to throw each other out, right? And they're having these drives because the property rights are secure and no one from the top can start moving people around and throwing them out. So I think we need to think very carefully about security of property rights. And the problem is our slum dwellers, literally, I mean, they are slum dwellers because they don't have regularized property, and we've made no effort to regularize their property. So, the courts don't recognize them. No one recognizes them except the politicians who get their votes, right? So shockingly enough, the biggest supporters of slum dwellers are politicians, right? That's the surprising thing, but they are the ones who make sure they get some kind of water access, some electricity access, BPL cards and things. So this is, as you said, it's a bigger knot to untangle than just one mission and one vehicle, right? It's everywhere, all branches of government, all layers of government.
Yeah, thank you
Great.
so much.
So I'm going to stop because there's so many questions. Sudeep, would you like to?
Yeah, I would like to begin with one of the questions by Professor Himani Bakshi, and she's saying that given the lack of power of generating own tax revenue, what are the other avenues through which cities can earn and provide basic amenities to the people?
So really three, and I think they're all worse than own tax revenue, and I'll explain why. Number one is user fees, right? So user fee tends to be very efficient. So now, the municipality or the urban local government of so-and-so is going to charge for roads, it's going to charge for garbage pickup and things like that. The problem with user fees is they can be quite regressive depending on which fee you are talking about, right? If you're talking about water, right, user fee tends to be pretty rational, right? Smaller families, poorer families they don't tend to wash 3 cars, and they don't tend to, have swimming pools and things like that. If you're talking about user fees for things like roads, then you are, suddenly in very regressive territory, right? So the poor are already paying for water, as you can see, right? Most cities poor pay privately for water. But if you start paying user fees for walking on pavements and roads and other things, access to the local parks and the amphitheater, then you are very much excluding the poor from basic common spaces and services. So I like the user fee model for garbage pickup, water, electricity, things where we can measure per unit and it doesn't become regressive and it's not exclusionary, right? So that's how I would think about it. But user fee is a great way of raising revenue, right? I mean, you pay for as much as you use. In Mumbai, you're basically subsidizing middle-class people and film stars by giving them very cheap water, right? While half of Maharashtra is in drought. So user fees has a way of fixing that and rationalizing that. The second is intergovernmental transfers, which I already told you I'm not a fan of, right? I think intergovernmental transfers can work great for a singular project. You know, you want to build a big metro service, or you want to connect the metro that is in Pune with the metro that is in Mumbai, right? That requires a lot of money. It's not clear which constituency will pay for it. So maybe the state can give a big transfer and they can pay for it, right? Because the residents of Pune or the residents of Mumbai may not be in favor of it. So for very specific projects, I think intergovernmental transfers are a good idea from state to local. But you know, I mean, you can't run your house. You can't buy dal chawal with intergovernmental transfers is my point. Okay, that needs to come from the people. That you have to earn with own tax revenue. The third, as I mentioned, is debt, right? And this also tends to be a good instrument, except India's bond markets are very weak. You know, we don't even rate even our state level bonds, right? Each state issuing its own debt paper. It's not rationalized because RBI at the end of the day is backstopping everything, right? So you have terrible states whose finances are in a mess, and you have great states whose finances are fine. But there, you know, there isn't a difference in the bond rates of those two states. So the bond market is not well developed enough, I think, to have functional municipal bonds. But if we can develop that market, I think Ahmedabad is a classic example of a city which has issued bonds in the past and can actually do it really well. You know, Ahmedabad has a long track record of urbanization. It has lots of urban experts. It's actually grown in a very systematic way. And, you know, earlier Ahmedabad didn't have problems like big mega projects, but now it does, right? And for big mega projects, debt is a great instrument because you need the money now and you can pay for it over a long period of time. I'll give you the best use case for debt: sewage systems. Okay, the people that sewage systems benefit are not even born yet. The people who benefit most from sewage systems are between age 0 to 1 and 0 to 5. Why? Because bad public sanitation increases infant mortality, right? And child mortality, right? That is a great example of how nobody today wants to pay for these investments, but we are literally killing our own children. But it requires a huge outlay in the present, and all the benefits are in the future, right? That kid needs to be born, it needs to survive, and then it needs to vote 18 years later. Who's going to take this on, right? So for something like that, debt works as a fantastic instrument. You know, bridges used to be an example of this. I think India needs more sewage system than it needs bridges, but you know, so these are some examples of how we can use debt.
Thank you so much. There is a question by Professor Karthik Kawale, if he agrees to come on camera. Karthik?
Dr. Rajagopalan, am I audible?
Yes, you are perfectly.
No, this was a very interesting conversation. Thank you so much. My question is about this feedback mechanism between a city government's accountability to its people and its ability to raise taxes. I understand the basic principle, but the question, of course, is how exactly does the loop get closed? Right now, one answer in the literature, for instance, with Tibu, the famous argument is that the feedback mechanism gets closed because cities compete for revenue, for tax revenue. Right? If they don't provide the right kinds of services, then people will vote with their feet, they'll go elsewhere, right? But the thing, of course, is that we also know that the Tibu mechanism actually can create problems as well. In the US, for instance, what happens is that the Tibu mechanism is used by local governments to exclude poor people, Black people, and to create school districts which cater only to the very, very wealthy. The question is, what are the other ways? Because you kept saying that the money is there, right? So the reason why sewage systems are not being built is not that cities are not able to compete for money that's elsewhere. The money is already there. And so I just want to, and for me, it seems like it's more an institutional issue. It's not that the market mechanism is not being exploited. It's more that mechanisms, that coordination mechanisms are not being put in place to treat, and as a sort of Marxist Schumpeterian person, I would think of this as, well, we are not treating our sewage systems as capital. We are not treating our footpaths as capital, because we're not allowing cities to, go in the bond market and say, well, you give me 10,000 rupees now, I'll build my sewage system and then pay you back later, right? We're not treating these assets as capital, and that's why we are short supplying, these assets. And that doesn't seem to be a market mechanism problem. It seems to be a coordination mechanism problem.
So these are great questions. And so I'll start with the first, so for me, this binary between market versus government, it doesn't work very well. I'll tell you why. So let's take the example, the Tibu example that you gave. Okay. Tibu mechanism actually works fantastically well. Local governments are thwarting it, right? The example you gave of local governments using Tibu is actually they are crushing Tibu, right? You create school districts. So what's the insight of Tibu? Insight of Tibu is not that you have local government. Insight of Tibu is that you can vote with your feet easily. When you have school districts, people can't vote with their feet. You're killing the competition, right? So what market insight we can borrow to governance systems is who is competing for what, okay? Are schools allowed to compete for people, right? Now, local governments, knowing the Tibu insight, make sure that you can't. So what ends up happening in American, local governments is you choose where you live based on the school your child wants to go to. That drives up real estate prices, which means poor get excluded and the rich get included. If you said anyone can go to any school, right? Then people will actually vote with their feet and they live where they live. And then the local governance has to respond to, if I want this guy's votes and I want his property taxes, I better do something about it, right? So I would actually flip what you're saying. I think the local politicians in the US are clever and a half. They have actually thwarted Tibu mechanisms, not propelled Tibu mechanisms, right? Now, coming to, let's say, places like Gurgaon, right? There's a lot of voting between the feet, either between different apartment complexes or between different enclaves, even within DLF, between DLF and Sushant and so forth. Now, I'm not minimizing the problems of the poor or the disenfranchised, but there are buildings in Gurgaon where the maids will not work in this building because there is no service elevator. Okay, I mean, I know we have all these problems of caste and class and things like that in India, but there are maids who say we refuse to climb the stairs and they won't allow us in the lift, so we won't work in the building, right? So in an ideal world, of course, everyone should use the same elevator. But what I mean is there is voting in the feet on all margins, right? Some of it is visible, some of it is invisible, right? There are people more likely to go to places where there is lower income housing and, within the same enclave, or at least, there is what they call the servant quarter, right? Each home or each apartment building has it. Now, we can't get rid of our caste and class problems, but at least they have supplied some kind of dignified housing, right, for people who serve them. Big cities, public cities have not managed to do that. So I think it's a question of finding what are they competing for and how are they competing. Now, what I absolutely agree with you upon is that our competition mechanisms are completely broken in India. Right? We neither have good Tibu nor do we have bad Tibu. We have no Tibu, right? We don't have a municipal bond market. So how do we rationalize bond prices, right? And build sewage systems. The specific question of sewage that you mentioned is very interesting. Now, you're right. It is a capital problem. And actually, I would go one step beyond. It's a human capital problem and a physical capital problem. If
I meant a physical capital problem.
Yeah, no, but I'm saying it's also human capital. If children don't survive because you have open defecation, you are also killing your human capital stock, not just your physical. So, it's a mega capital problem, right? Yeah. Now, let's come to the sewage systems. Now, let me think from a point of view of a local municipal elected official, okay? I don't have too much power. I mean, I can veto some building permits and all, but I don't have too much power. I don't have too much money, right? I need to keep going and begging some IAS officer or state level officer in, wherever, Gandhinagar or, Delhi or Haryana, wherever, to the local office, relative to the local office. Now, what can I do? Now, let's say I'm very entrepreneurial and I decide to build the sewage system. What do I need to do? I need to collect money. That's step one of the problem. Okay, let's say I write to, Prime Minister Modi and I get some renewal mission money. So the money problem is solved. Now, the second stage problem is I have to dig up everywhere for 5 years. right? So as a politician, all my costs are in the present. All the benefits are 20 years from today for the kids who survive because I've cleaned up the city, and for, the people who are living longer and enjoying better ecology and things like that. But no one cares about that right now. Right now, everyone's going to give gali to the guy who dug up the whole city, right? You dig up one road. I mean, look at what's happening in Mumbai. They're building a metro in a city which is bursting at its seams. And every day people are tweeting angry tweets about the traffic that is caused by the metro, right? So for a politician, not for the society, for the politician, all the costs are in the present. All the benefits are in the future, but we don't have 20-year electoral terms, thank God. We have 4-year, 5-year electoral terms, right? So this man needs, or woman, more likely if it's an urban local body, needs to build this within 3-4 years. And that's very difficult to do with metro, sewage. The big capital stock you're talking about, it's very hard to do that. It's easier to do that with pavements, electrification, even maybe like a water pipeline and things like that. But the really heavy capital stock, it's not in their incentive to do it. That is what Ambedkar and Nehru were thinking when they centralized it, right? And now we realize that's an even worse option. So this is a conundrum we need to solve by building urban local bodies, which are a little bit long run. I'll tell you the good news after giving you so much bad news. Urban local body and Panchayati Raj institutions are very new in India. If you think about it in terms of electoral cycles, they've had only 4 or 5. Panchayati Raj a little bit more, but 73rd Amendment happened 25, 27 years ago, right? So we've only had 3-4 rounds of elected government, 5 in some cases. And that, I think, will improve over time. As we have greater democratic participation at that level, all the peri-urban and township areas that Professor Mona Mehta was talking about, right? Those sorts of spaces, now suddenly you have more democratic participation, and maybe as they get richer, you will have, you'll also solve the fiscal. But I think that part is slowly improving. You see Gram Panchayats, we don't have Gram Panchayats, which is the, full constituency body meeting, right? Which you need to have in Panchayati Raj institutions, but you don't need it for urban local bodies. So we don't have it in urban areas, but in rural areas, they're a roaring success, right? You now have children's Gram Panchayat where kids come and say, hey, the school doesn't have water and the school doesn't have a functional playground and blackboards and things. So I am a little bit hopeful that eventually the democratic process will solve the small problems, but the big capital stock problems, I only see the source of the problem. I'm unable to offer a better solution.
Yeah, thank you so much. We are already up. It is 8:30. So I request for 10 more minutes.
Absolutely.
Because there is a student that I would like to invite.
Yes,
and,
please, no problem.
She's very keen to ask that question. So may I invite
Soumya? No. If you talk too much, one must pay the tax. So I will happily take questions.
Yeah, Soumya Tandon, if you are here.
Yes, sir. Good evening, ma'am. I have been a student of architecture and I'm currently studying MBA at Ahmedabad University. So my question I come from that headspace. So my question is that, what do you think about the relationship between the scale of a city and its ability to sustain it? And this is not just in terms of the geographical boundary, but also in terms of population. The example I have in my mind is Bangalore, because when we travel from one place to another in Bangalore, we don't measure the distance in kilometers, we measure it in time. It doesn't the distance.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I grew up in Delhi, I think in minutes and hours. Yeah.
True. So what do you think? Should there be a limit on the geographical definition of a city in terms of boundary and population?
No. I'll tell you why, for 2-3 reasons. So I live in the greater Washington, D.C. area, right? So the city I live in is Arlington, right? But we kind of, all the cities around Washington, D.C. feed off on that particular economy, right? Before this, I used to live in the greater New York area. So I happen to live in New York City, not in the greater area, but you see the point. So now whether you call it Washington, D.C. or whether you call it Arlington, if all the jobs are in Washington, D.C., people are going to travel, right? So whether you want to label it interstate travel, interspace travel, interstellar travel, it doesn't matter. If the jobs are in one place, people are going to go there, right? The relevant question is slightly different. Forget places like New York City, which is literally an island. So there is a physical constraint, right? Why aren't the homes where the jobs are? That's my question. right? Now you are an architecture student and you are a business student, right? You can very easily combine urban planning and development along with, not just the aesthetics, but actually physical structures, right? When you asked the question, you said, I come from that space, right? You think spatially, right? Unlike the rest of us. So you can very easily imagine, why aren't we building tall? Right? You mentioned, I read something fantastic in Tim Harford's book recently, it's somewhere here. It's 50 modern inventions that changed the world or something like that. He talks about how an elevator is a mass transit system, right? A metro is a mass transit system. One is going from Arlington to Washington, DC. One is going above to below, right? But if you think about skyscrapers, and I lived in New York City for more than a decade, an elevator carries more people than a bus, right? So what is causing a world where the people need to work in one place, but they cannot live in the same place? Now, sometimes there are very pragmatic and personal reasons. I need a big garden and I like to garden and grow my own flowers and whatever, right? Sometimes it is where the jobs are, the schools aren't there. So if you have kids, you need to live near the school, you can't live near the job. That is what we have to figure out as a society. Most people's lives are within 10 square miles, less probably, maybe 4 square miles actually, right? Now, why is it that we have created urban systems and structures such that everything we need is not in those 4 square miles, right? India does not, cities like Bangalore don't have new schools coming up every month, but they have new malls coming up every month. Who is the zoning commissioner and who is issuing these stupid permits? Right? That you cannot build tall unless you're a mall or a movie theater, that schools cannot be built tall. Schools need to be built wide. Why? Can't you learn in tall buildings? So there is like a really messed up system of how people in power don't think spatially. And I think that's where people like you, with your unique background, can be of incredible service, both in terms of governance and planning and things like that, but also in writing and pointing out these problems. Why are you zoning in a way that I need to travel 3 hours to go across 10 minutes to drop my kid at school and pick up my kid from school? It's ludicrous, right? I mean, in no other, and look at India, like people care so much about education. There are kids that, there are parents actually who are just glorified chauffeurs and, chaperones, taking their kids in buses and autos to take them to, soccer practice and, take them to maths tuition and things like that. Why isn't it nearby? Right? That's the question. If it's nearby, why isn't it of high enough quality? And by the way, Bangalore is probably the richest people in India. The urban, posh, IT residents, they are the people who gain the most from liberalization. Why doesn't it show up in their city? And why does it only show up in their malls? Right? So it's not that these things are not popping up. You only see them in malls in Noida and Bangalore. You don't see them in the streets. You don't see them in the skyscrapers. You don't see them in the playgrounds or the schools. And, so I think that's the way I would ask the question, which is, you are right. We are traveling in time. It's almost interspace travel. The other day, last time I was in Mumbai, someone asked me to meet them somewhere. And I said, it takes about the same time as if I flew from Delhi to meet you, then going from Chembur to Goregaon. So I said, I'll just see you next time somewhere else, because it's a shorter trip. So that's kind of, what you need to solve. The metro is great, by the way, now to go from Chembur to Andheri. I used it last time. It's 35 minutes. It's got a women's compartment. Everyone's reading in the women's compartment. Nothing gives me more joy than that. It was very crowded, but it was a great experience to take that metro and do this in 40 minutes. That would have taken, say, 2.5 hours. And the size of Bangalore makes that possible. The size of Mumbai makes that possible.
Thank you so much. We have taken your time, but there are a couple of more questions that we would like to take with your
permission.
Go ahead. So I would like to invite Professor Darshini Mahadevia. She has a question or comment. So if she can come on camera.
Thank you, Subir. I was just hoping that you don't ask me because on a Saturday evening, I'm listening to this very interesting conversation. Having dealt with urban planning after for 25 years or more, Shruti, at the end of it, I know that it's really difficult to do many things, and for all the reasons that you have said. Also, one has looked at how the history of urbanization has changed and when changes have come. And I think irrespective of what the professionals, and one of my young colleague who just spoke, the architect, and now one who is in business, we think that we would be able to write the destinies of the people. That's not the case as urban planner or architects, because a lot more changes have come in the cities through, I think, more political mobilizations. And when people have wanted changes, that they pushed the governments to take decisions one way or the other, the way finances get distributed, to what would be the priorities on financing, and so on. So I think I just also want to tell Mona that it's not just simple decentralization or participation that will work, because if you would do that in a highly unequal society, you know how and that's why there has been this constant tension in public finance between equity and efficiency, is to whether we redistribute or we sort of decentralize. If we don't redistribute and just decentralize, then I'm sure Maharashtra and Gujarat are going to fly, and you would have no urbanization in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. And if you try to balance it, what we did in the earlier, then there are mal effects of that. And I think it's basically very little political accountability at all levels in our system that people are not asking. Otherwise, why post Second World War the European cities transform so rapidly, planning or no planning? And there were massive, through whatever Marshall Plan or whatever, massive investments in public housing. I mean, many of those areas have now become ghettos in, let's say, Paris, and where you've seen riots. So there is no one answer that's going to be there forever. And I think what is missing in Indian city, I mean, you must remember the story of Brazil and the Right to the City campaign, which they started post 1994. And that's the part where the dictatorship comes to an end, the electoral politics sets in, and it is the People's Party, a Workers' Party, that rises with decent distributive policy. And from there comes the city statute and the right to city movement. But that's just been completely broken by the previous ruler. But Bolsonaro has killed it completely and he's undone the right to city. So whatever even gains in terms of decentralization and political power to the people at the city level through social movements can get completely eroded if we have wrong kind of politics that come in. And today in India, if we are talking about many of these things, but look at the kind of centralization of power that has happened across the country. And I think it's not just that a centralization of power has happened at the national level, but you look at the way state governments are functioning. The family dynasties and autarchies and etc. No, in that, to talk about decentralization, it needs to be not decentralization, which is a mechanical or administrative decentralization, but much more of pressure from the bottom to change not just the policy, but make them effective. And I think recently we are seeing this farmers struggle ongoing, and it's a good example of how this kind of will work. So I think even Kerala example that Shruti gave, it's built on a long social movement
History,
over a century and a history of that. So I think we need to look at it. And I don't agree, sorry, Shrutika, with many of these discussions that even K.C. Shivramakrishnan have done, because it's all talking about mechanical decentralization of urban systems.
So I'll tell you, thanks so much. It's a very insightful comment. I'll tell you something interesting. I recently spoke with Professor Biju Rao, who's at the World Bank, and he told me we need to think of these things as a sandwich structure. okay, you have to have the constitutional and fiscal arrangements in place. Because if you have very rapid development without them, then there's a pipeline problem. But at the same time, just having that system in place doesn't mean you'll get genuine democratic participation. That needs to come bottom up. So my argument, as you know, I rightly agree with you, Darshini. I'm not making an argument for doing this without the bottom up process. It's just I'm a constitutional economist. So what I study is the constitutional mechanism, right? So I tend to study the public finance aspect and the constitutional amendments of 73rd and 74th Amendment. But what you're saying is absolutely right. Like, we need to think about, and you know, one part where I disagree with you is, I think I really appreciate social movements, but I think for something like cities, which are long run governance capabilities that need to be built, I don't think we can rely on social movements.
No,
I think they
no,
can kick things off.
no,
but
I agree
really-
with you that it's not social movement in the narrow sense that an NGO comes and a political party comes and does that. There's much larger mobilization around the political ideology
Yeah,
that
and I
will
would
run.
call that,
So,
yeah,
so that's
I
what
would
was
just call
the
that democratic process, right?
Yeah, so
Democratic
it is
process
what
that
we
civil
had after
society.
Second World War, of certain kind of need for a social democracy to be kicking in after the Second World War due to pressure of Eastern Bloc and Russia and others, and that moved the public policy paradigm in a certain direction. And so that's what I'm meaning. I'm not saying that one social movement in a city is going to kind of do that, any kind of systemic changes that are going to be
So my
happening.
question is always, you know, we have all the energy. The question is, how do you harness it through the democratic process? So it's really a question of threading the needle. You know, we have people who are well intentioned, we have people who have money, we
For
have
the
people who are willing
students,
to
and I
participate
also,
democratically,
sorry.
we have civil society. But how do you thread the needle such that it all goes through one loop and feedback mechanism? I think that is sort of my inquiry, which is not to disagree with the, you know, the big historical context. I agree that is so important. In fact, you know, cities are built over 200 years. They're not built over 2 days, right? So there is that element of it. So I think, you know, that point of yours is very well taken. But the sustainability project for me has to come both from the top and the bottom. You know, and when I say the top, I don't mean from the political top, I mean from the institutional head. You know, how do we distribute power between central, state, and local government, and not centralize everything in union government? That's one question. How do we distribute power between legislature, executive, and judiciary, and don't just centralize it all in the executive? That's another question, right? I mean, like you said, centralization of power, it's running vertically and horizontally. And then there is, of course, you know, civil society participation, voting, fiscal autonomy. So, I mean, this is so hard. I don't think I have all the answers, but it's more an approach of, you know, how would I layer the institutions around it?
So I just wanted to say something, and that's really not what we are doing at the university. We are not looking at our education from one lens or the other, because now, as you said, that I'm looking at it from this lens, and that's the answer I get. But I think we're now trying to look at a problem from multiple lenses, because we have done looking at a problem from the same one lens forever and ever. And I think we get trapped in its vocabulary and the way of expressing, but the problem remains the same. So, but that's the kind of education approach we have taken at Ahmedabad
No,
University,
I
of
think
not
that's a
doing that.
great approach.
And
And you know, you have so many different people who are architects, people from business, people from political science, economics. I mean, that's, I think, the only way to do this. We need, you know, both the division of labor and specialization. Each one of us needs to study a topic in detail, but at the end of the day, we all need to put our heads together and solve the problem. So I think that's very well
Thank you so
taken.
much,
And
for that.
congratulations on that program at your university.
Thank you so much. Professor Mona, if you want to take any question that you find interesting, one of the last couple of questions or one question.
There was, I mean, I'm just soaking in this beautiful conversation that was going on, and you know, I mean, you know, and maybe I can reflect on that, or I can take another question. There was one question that I saw was.
You can let me know. There was one question by Professor Sonal Yadav and another by Amol. So Amol was saying that.
Mola Agarwal's question was about Gandhi and vision of cities, and
Sorry,
and
what's the question?
Okay, let me read out the question, Shruti. It says Mahatma Gandhi was not really
I got it. Yeah.
favor of cities. He said India resides in villages. We have both a Gandhi scholar and a constitutional scholar in this conversation. What do they think about Gandhi's views on cities? Haven't we got worst of both worlds? We neither have we've not focused on cities nor villages. I think I think yes, to some extent it is true that we have we are sort of neither here nor there. And sometimes we've also sort of over-focused on cities in a sort of a very unidimensional way, not looking at the connections of cities or connections of the urban with the non-urban, and the complex ways in which this is a sort of a larger ecosystem. So I mean, Gandhi, I think of the city and I think of Gandhi and then I think of Ambedkar, Gandhi really sort of thought of city, the village as a sort of an organic reality where, people there was a sort of natural division of labor, but also his aversion to cities came, I think, from his philosophical standpoint, which is that cities to him represented a sort of human beings who are out of control, in the sense of we've sort of overindulgent and have lost our sense of control over ourselves. I mean, that's sort of one way of looking at how Gandhi looks at cities, and and why he prefers villages. I'm not saying he's right or wrong. And then I think of Ambedkar, who, as a Dalit person who was so sort of faced firsthand the kind of oppression of caste in India, he pegged a lot of hope in cities, right? Cities for him were the place where we could escape from the sort of the what he called the cesspool of the village, where there was caste and there was division. Yeah, the sinkholes. Yes, cesspool, sinkholes. And of course, I think, my larger comment is that I think neither Ambedkar nor Gandhi were entirely right, in the sense that cities have not ended up being the sort of panacea of equality and justice. I mean, our cities are extremely divided along caste, gender, religion, and so I think the question again goes back to what Darshini said about how do we have a vision of social democracy, and a sort of larger political mobilization that can take control and challenge what I believe is the problem of a neoliberal politics, which uses a language of freedom, which uses a language of of equality and access, but really is scuttling, I think, the democratic process by encouraging a certain kind of rabid capitalism, that is undoing a lot of the sort of grassroots, representational work that needs to be done. So I think I'll sort of end on that note.
Yeah, so I am, Mona, you've been very, very careful with both our big heroes. I'm a huge admirer of Gandhi, but I will completely walk away from his economics. I think it is bunkum. Okay, you can all imagine why I have so much of an affiliation for Ambedkar. I mean, Ambedkar is an economist. He was a lawyer. He was a constitutional expert. Everything I studied, Ambedkar provides great insight. So I'm, in any Gandhi versus Ambedkar debate, I always find myself, unabashedly affiliated with Ambedkar, right? So there's no question. And I admire a lot of other Gandhian values. I mean, I'm vegetarian and all of those sorts of things. But, on the question of cities and economics, I think it's just nonsense what Gandhi proposed. Okay, I'll tell you for 2-3 reasons. The only people who romanticize villages are people who live in cities. Okay, nobody in the village is romanticizing the village. What are they saying? We don't have electricity. We don't have water. We don't have schools. We don't have broadband. We cannot live a day outside the city if our cell phone towers are not functional. I mean, we're even willing to go to a village because now they have cell phone coverage, right? So this idea of like this whole romantic village republic grassroots, I mean, the only people who are romanticizing it are those of us who have never been to a village, okay, or never lived in one. So I am so far removed from that point of view. If people want to romanticize villages, live in the village, vote with your feet. India provides freedom of movement under Article 19. And this is a freedom we have really preserved. Move. China doesn't provide that freedom. It assigns people to regions, right? We provide that freedom. If you love a village, move there, right? None of the people romanticizing the village are actually living in a village because all the opportunities are in the city. So what they're doing actually is not romanticizing a village. They're using all their elite caste privilege to capture a city and convert it into a village. I want to be in the city. I want this great government or MNC job, but I don't want a skyscraper to cast a shadow on my lovely backyard where I grow my organic tulsi. These are the people who are romanticized. So, I have very little time for that narrative, right? So on this narrative, I mean, not to say Gandhi came up with that, but Gandhi has been appropriated by middle-class NIMBYism, which I really do not favor. And it's just reeks of caste privilege. The other thing is only the people who are in the top of the totem pole in a village want to be in a village. The people who are at the bottom of the totem pole want to leave, right? I mean, read Ambedkar's writings. He has this great piece on, how, I can't remember the title of the chapter. It's called something about a visa, how the visa for entry or something like that. And the subsection is called No Peon, No Water. Okay. And this section is like sort of etched in my memory.
I think it's called just getting a visa or something
Getting
like
a visa,
that.
exactly. That's the name of the piece. And the subheading says, no peon, no water. And Ambedkar talks about how he needed to sit outside the threshold of the classroom because he is Dalit, right? So he cannot be inside. Now, it's not just about space and how we share it. He could not touch the water jug, right? Which is not surprising to us, even in this century, unfortunately. So the peon would come and he would pour water from 4 feet on top. And Ambedkar would drink water like that. Okay.
So if I may interrupt you, Shruti, on just this point, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I mean, I take a lot of what you're saying, but did you also know that Ahmedabad has a Dalit middle class ghetto in the neighborhood called Chankira, right?
Yes.
The cities have not wiped away caste. Right?
I'm not saying the cities have wiped away caste, but cities do provide more opportunity. You are not cleaning toilets or picking, strawberries or whatever is the, Dalit equivalent of that in whichever village we're talking, right? In some places, it is picking rice. In some places, it is doing literal physical labor. In some places, it is working with manual scavenging. That is not what they are doing in cities. And if they're doing it in cities, they are part of that Safai Karamchari Association, which I also know is hugely caste-based. So I'm not saying cities are going to rid us of caste. I'm saying they provide more options than the village provides. See, the village creates two problems. The village never forgets. No one forgets what your grandfather did, what your father did, who they married, when you were born, and where you belong. Cities have a degree of anonymity. Now, the question I would actually ask in return. So the second thing is, we talk about equity and justice and all of these things, right? And fair enough, I do think all these things are very important and we need to afford that dignity to everybody. But please, we need to pay attention to people. They are voting with their feet and their life. They are moving to cities. If cities were such cruel, unjust places, why are people moving in the millions in India to cities? It must mean there is something even worse going on in villages, right? Just for perspective, I'm not saying cities are perfect, but if we assume that people are rational, and if we assume that these are people who are smart, who know what is best for themselves, and I will never assume otherwise. I'm never going to be one of those people who will say, oh, they're villagers, they're illiterate, they're low caste, they just don't know better. No, they know what they're doing. They are all moving in millions to cities. A pandemic devastated them. They went back. They're all going back, right? They are telling us something. We're just not listening to them, right? Now, Mona, I completely agree with your point on the big question. Why are they in ghettos? Why are even middle class communities in ghettos? Why do even in cities, those who are in the lowest caste or the most disenfranchised, living even within a slum in the worst parts of the slum, even within the slums, there are pecking order, right? Who stays near the water versus who stays near the toilet and who stays near the railway line and things like that. So we have a pecking order everywhere. In India, the pecking order is always determined by caste, gender, region, language, right? That is literally the order in which we determine our larger pecking order. I'm not saying when you go to the city, all that magically disappears. But all these people are voting with their feet and they want to move to cities. The reason they want to move to cities are more unequal than villages. Just look at Gini coefficients. City Gini coefficients are out of the whack, right? But that's where you have jobs. That's where you have division of labor. That's where you have a labor market.
No,
So
I
that's
should say, I think we actually agree.
no, we agree a lot.
On,
I'm
of course, I think.
not so much countering you. It's the narrative that is painted, which frankly drives me a little bit crazy. And I think too much Gandhianism.
No. I think Gandhi here has to be sort of, you can't take Gandhi literally, right?
Exactly.
I mean, his,
you can't take him literally.
So I think there is a sort of philosophical point here that he's saying. I think makes a lot of sense in, today as we tackle an ecological crisis and climate change and all of that. So I think, but, to sort of conclude, I think that I enjoyed this conversation because, there were so many things that I assumed as an economist. And of course, you have your lens as an economist and, I have mine. But I think that I found what I was surprised that we ended up sort of finding a lot of common ground rather than uncommon ground. And I think the common ground is that, yes, cities are very much worth saving, and we need to collectively think about how to make them more equitable, more livable, and more just, and I think governance is a domain in which a lot of thinking needs to be done. So thank you, Shruti, so much for such an amazing conversation and, for being, so engaging. And, I'm going to hand it over now to Sudhir to conclude.
Thank you so much, Mona, and thank you so much to both of you and others, those who interjected and asked questions. I mean, we wanted it to go on and on and on, but this is the dinner time for most of the people. So thank you so much. And I think we have got enough material for the next conversation on this topic, Gandhi, Ambedkar, and the city, because I teach a course, City as Text, and Gandhi, Ambedkar, Tagore, we throw it in the class like everybody, and on those names we discuss a lot. But I
would love to be an audience in that conversation. So please do invite me.
I would love to. I mean, we have a Gandhian scholar who looks at the city. I know Mona's work very closely. I have read some of your works, and I think another conversation with the topic on Gandhi, Ambedkar, and city is on the
card. I think, Sudhir, you need to be a part of that conversation.
But thank you so much. I think we are well past the diminishing marginal utility point as far as listening to me is concerned. But, first I want to really thank Mona. You have such thoughtful questions, and thank you for taking so much time to read and think about these topics. I greatly enjoyed, meeting you virtually and also listening to all your ideas. So thank you for that. And, also to Sudhir, Ravi, Bilal, everyone who put this conversation together. I know what it takes to organize things, and even in the virtual.
Thank you so much for saying this.
And finally, thank you to all the listeners. I cannot believe that you're all doing this on a Saturday night, but thank you so much for being here. You must be very hardcore urban governance people.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everybody, and see you next Saturday. Thank you so much for joining.